And the last thing that I need to do successfully here is to share my screen. So we'll do that real quickly. So good day, everybody. This is Trey Johnson with ZAP. I'm both our America's business leader and the organization's chief evangelist. And it's my great pleasure to talk to you today about bringing your ERP data to life using Power BI. This is one of the kind of staple topics that we encounter quite a bit interacting with customers, prospects, and partners alike. And so we're really keen to have today's conversation with you. Of course, nothing beats being able to be face-to-face and talking data to you in person, which we are super hopeful that we get to do again very soon. We do very much miss the opportunity to be in your regions, at your local events, and talking to you about the combination of ZAP Data Hub, Power BI, and really unlocking the data within your ERP. So I know that our title for the day was the 5 ways to bring your ERP data into Power BI. And so what we did is we really kind of structured the agenda around the 5 key topics that we wanted to cover off. And so we'll start by talking with you a bit about the needs continuum for analytics in your ERP, specifically really focusing on the data side of things. We'll make sure we cover off the options that are available to you really regardless of what ERP you're running, but specifically from our place of knowledge around the Dynamics applications, the Sage ERP applications, SAP Business One, and SysPro as ERP platforms. But again, if you're running Acumatica or something else along those lines, a lot of the topic will apply as well. We'll explore the ways that you can kind of end up with the right approach for your given data scenario, and ultimately talking about the ways that the ERP apps can be unlocked within Power BI. And we'd be remiss if, as a software company, we didn't do a little bit of a software spotlight on the things that we do pretty uniquely around bringing ERP data into Power BI. So we'll close out with that. But for starters, for those of you that are not familiar with ZAP, which I imagine is possibly the minority on this call, just a little bit of an introduction. We got our start in 2001, so we are absolutely at the 20-year mark as a business. We have been providing data and analytics software for essentially all of the mid-market ERPs for a number of years. Beyond that, we also have support for CRM applications and other applications that might be of interest to some of you, but more so, it's the combination of your mid-market ERP and the other data that you have as an organization. We've had the good fortune of enabling customers in over 45 countries. This is reflected kind of by the push pins. We have very much global operations, but we're very proud of the fact that whether you're a customer or a partner, that you have the support and the resources that you need in our 3 major regions, being the Americas region, the EMEA region, and the Asia Pacific region. Certainly, as you can see by the logos on the bottom of the screen and the pictures of folks, we're really passionate about the diversity of data sources that we do support, starting with the ERPs that are listed there, and certainly look forward to learning more about some of you that maybe are meeting us for the first time. So in terms of the needs continuum for analytics around the ERP, what we've really done, and we've had the good fortune of mapping this out with a number of customers, is helping them see where they are on the continuum, starting with kind of the rising axis from a business decision-making standpoint. A lot of the things that we do within the context of the ERP are quite tactical in nature and ultimately evolve to more senior levels around the data usage being strategic. Correspondingly, the axis that's running across the bottom really starts to address the complexity of data and the need for additional data and monitoring and managing additional business processes. So when we look a little bit more closely at this, when we start with the system reports, these are really those basic reports that you've been running out of your ERP, or you've had built for you to kind of address kind of the very essential functions of some of the business processes within the system. those certainly give, kind of those tactical point in time, insights, but most would probably argue that there's not a lot of strategic value associated with those. Once the results become a bit more interactive, this really provides for the opportunity for your users to start to do what I like to suggest is ask slightly additional questions and get, additional answers. And, that could be the users able to change some elements of the filtering that they see. They're able to potentially explore sorting the data in a slightly different fashion. Basically, they're having like this mild level of empowerment around getting those additional answers from those additional questions that they ask. The next step in the continuum really revolves around the ability to kind of go beyond maybe some summary statistics that are coming out in some of the interactive reports, and where needed, go off and explore the detail. And there's a reference to D365 kind of drilling back to the UI here, but realistically, if you're sitting on any product that has a URL invocation of the screens, within the ERP, most of the time you can end up with a solution where the reporting platform will allow for you to go from essentially a summarized report to a detailed report, and within that detailed report have some level of URL connectivity that takes you back into the application. If you're still running and let's call applications that are maybe a little bit legacy in nature from a user interface perspective, maybe there's not quite as much kind of navigation back to the results. However, I think one of the things that's essential is when we do present users with summary information, we have to give them the ability to look at the details so that they can better understand what's going on with the business. As the maturity continues along this continuum, organizations start to really empower decision makers strategically, with dashboards, with slightly more compound analytics. But these are analytics that are very much starting to be associated with the roles of the user. For example, sales management is going to have their set of analytics that are relevant and important to them, whereas financial management or the CFO or controller are going to want to look at things in a slightly different way. They're certainly kind of a big stepping stone in terms of where the prior steps were in the continuum to move beyond simply tactical decision making and start to allow for looking across time and looking at trends and things of that nature. And that's particularly valuable. And I think that's probably why a lot of you that are attending the webinar have come to us, because maybe you've done a lot of the kind of the earlier steps, but maybe aren't quite at the point where you're leveraging Power BI for that strategic decision making in very much a user-oriented way. The next step that I think is important to consider is where you have the user configured analytics. And so these are beyond just simply having a dashboard for sales and a dashboard for other areas of the business, but also giving the opportunity for the organization to not only each have a view, but also to start to create composites for different audiences. So if I'm sitting in the purchasing arena, I may need elements from sales, finance, manufacturing, and inventory management, really to give me that proper view that I can use to analyze the business. And in a lot of cases, once we get to the point where we have the analytics for the user roles, the demand from the organization, from those users, is such that we've got to empower them in such a way to do a little bit of building for themselves. And so that's something to keep in mind as you think about bringing your ERP data across into a platform like Power BI. How are you going to not only support building for those different audiences, but at some point, how are you going to support allowing those audiences to build certain things for themselves? And so that's particularly important. Additionally, if we kind of navigate kind of down the axis to the bottom, user configured analytics being both more strategic in nature and looking across multiple modules starts to really bring in additional sources of data. A great example that we use quite often is a lot of times sales teams are not necessarily given a lot of insight into what's happening really post-sale or within the context of the ERP. So their view of the world tends to be a little bit more CRM oriented. And while it's great that they have that CRM orientation, what they lose is the ability to understand, how great a customer is, or actually, of course, how poor they potentially are. So as an example, if you bring forward elements like the accounts receivable behavior for your customers, and you bring forward kind of the returns and the other kind of behavioral things that happen around order fulfillment, those sort of things being put in front of that salesperson allows that salesperson to understand, yes, when they get in front of a certain account, orders are placed and so on and so forth, but it also helps them understand, does that account behave well with the rest of the organization? Are they paying their bills? Are they doing a lot of those sorts of things? And so those are things just to consider, as you continue to expand on how you're going to bring data together, ERP being prominent, but certainly additional data being part of the mix. And then kind of the Valhalla, if you will, is the opportunity to really monitor all of the additional business processes of the organization. And so having that data at hand and to support the tactical scenarios, but allow for you to start to project where are we headed, what is happening with the business, those sorts of things. And more importantly, keep an eye on business processes that may trend in a direction that we wouldn't necessarily understand real time are very important. This is particularly important or particularly amplified as a result of the pandemic that we've really kind of all come through, where the things that have been the standard for our business maybe for a number of years changed dramatically, and what do those changes do to the rest of the behavior across the business? And so being able to monitor the business processes is certainly one of those elements. What's really nice about the monitoring side of things, typically there's some level of goals orientation. That means that if the goals aren't directly within systems, you should have the facility to bring that data in alongside of it. And so all of these things being said, the reality is sometimes you get stuck on your tactical needs. And there's a number of different kind of quotes that we have heard in a variety of different ways. We have too many reports, or we don't have enough reports. Our reports don't give us the information that we need, or, I really understand pretty fervently that there's, folks that are sitting there saying, hey, I just want Excel. I just want to look at a spreadsheet. I have columns and rows and I'm good. And then the next person says, hey, all of our reports are different and they don't match up. I look from spreadsheet to spreadsheet and I can't figure out what is the right gross margin calculation, so on and so forth. And I think we've all been at the place at some point, regardless of what ERP we're running, where we've thought that we were getting more reporting and analytics out of the ERP than maybe has arrived for our purposes. And so those are amongst many of them. And in the last one, certainly many of you may be in this boat that you're the only one who can create any reports for the business. And so now you're probably in a pressurized situation where their business wants more. They want maybe different analytics and different platforms to analyze by. So where does that mean most organizations are on this continuum? In our experience, and ZAP, has the benefit of, there's customers across the globe, across many ERPs. A lot of organizations are kind of hovering between, they've navigated beyond system reports and have some level of interactive results. They may have some navigation to the underlying detail. They aren't particularly mature, and I don't say that in an offensive way, around their solution set. It's just that they're inhibited because maybe it was the budgetary aspects, as some of you have indicated to our initial poll. Maybe there's just simply some absence of skills around tools like Power BI, which is very much understandable. There may be a level of user passion for tools that they don't want to go away, like Excel, and Excel doesn't have to go away, and we'll show a little bit of that a little bit later. Or it may be that the approach to getting to the next level of information just feels very technically complex, and the investments made to get to that resolution just don't seem like something your organization wants to do. And it could very well just be that the time to get to some value just seems a bit long. So all of these things, play very well into the other elements that we want to discuss as it relates to bringing your ERP data into Power BI. And so what we've done is we've really kind of explored a few different options, and I apologize for D365 kind of being featured prominently here. It's actually supposed to be multiple ERPs, but we'll talk to the options around querying multiple ERPs, a lot of the common patterns that we see. We'll explore, what it means to do the modeling within Power BI, and then we'll just talk to you a little bit about what Zap Data Hub does in support of the data platform for Power BI, starting with your ERP. So in terms of some quick terminology, because I realize not everybody may be on the same page here, I think we're all probably familiar with SQL. We're all probably familiar with the term, SQL and query being somewhat synonymous. But there's some other ways that applications can be accessed. And so depending on the nature of the ERP, we know firsthand a lot of the Sage ERPs that have been traditionally run on premise, they have a traditional query interface, a traditional database that's interfaced with. And so that's more on the lines of kind of SQL type queries that are issued against the systems. Same is true with SAP Business One and SysPro for that matter. As applications move to the cloud, D365, Acumatica, others, there's more of kind of an application layer that's interacted with. And so OData happens to be that application layer that's interacted with for the extraction of data from cloud applications. Within the context of some of the ERPs, they have started to create facilities for the purposes of reporting. Now we know that Sage X3 as an ERP platform has some element of kind of inbuilt data warehousing that occurs with it. Same is true of some of the D365 applications. And so the entity store is somewhat synonymous with having an operational data store that supports reporting. In the case of D365, that's managed within the admin UI, and I believe the same is true of X3 as well. The other option is the vendors oftentimes will give you some means, well, not often, but sometimes will give you the means to replicate to other areas. And so that in this case, BYOD represents that, or bring your own database. And then lastly, but something that's really important and somewhat synonymous with using Power BI is the concept of the Dataverse. Now the Dataverse, which we'll talk to a little bit more in just a moment, is a very Microsoft-oriented view of common structures to support businesses and applications, and the data storage service that kind of underpins the Dataverse allows for the apps, be them Microsoft ERP applications or other applications, to publish data to them, and then correspondingly tools like Power BI can extract data from them. So let's talk a little bit about the OData side of things, especially as it relates to Power BI. So Power BI can absolutely interact with an OData provider. Now, just happen to be using some screenshots of the Business Central, Dynamics 365 Business Central connectivity here as one of the means with which we connect. And so the challenges or the characteristics, if you will, for OData is it tends to be slow in nature. There can be throttling. We have seen throttling with some of the providers that makes for not the greatest experience, especially when you're talking about, trying to move larger amounts of data out. It's not a great option, as we say here, for multiple models for Power BI. If you're not familiar with Power BI at all as a platform, you've probably seen visualizations. That is what Power BI is most known for, but Power BI also has models that underpin those visualizations, or basically the way data is brought in as data sets and then provided up for reporting. So anytime that you need to replicate that particular set of data across multiple sets of Power BI analytics, that's where we say it's not great for those multiple models type scenario. Some of the ERP applications require some manipulation administratively of the ERP to support things. For example, there's a need to add web services for each query with Business Central. I recall that Acumatica at one point had some requirements around actually OData enabling certain entities and so on and so forth. So that can certainly be challenging. The other part that can be challenging is the requirements might expand exponentially. For example, in Business Central, because they replicate data per table per company, then all of a sudden you're actually turning on quite a bit more in the way of web services and those sorts of things. So that's just something generally to be aware of. The next real kind of option for querying is, and I would really probably characterize this not so much in the Microsoft term of entity stores as it relates to the D365 applications, but basically other data stores, replicated data stores that the vendor provides. They're basically providing a capability for Power BI to do what is called direct query. Now, where the direct query is different than OData is OData really requires that you're importing the data into Power BI as a data set underneath the report. Direct query means that you can directly interact with this ERP data store, ask the question from Power BI, get the result back. Now, the challenge with the direct query behavior is concurrency. If you have a lot of users that are interacting with a direct query source, that can obviously have some impact on the availability of the data platform for all of the concurrent users. What typically combats that is there's the entities themselves, the tables, the views, for lack of a better way of describing it, tend to be optimized a bit more for reporting. So it's not exactly the same as the ledger view or the sub-ledger view underneath the ERP application, but it is slightly more enhanced and possibly stripped down, depending on how you kind of approach it for the purposes of reporting. In the case of the Microsoft world, and specifically D365, it leverages Power BI's embedded service. And what that ultimately means is that there's a wall that's built around what Power BI can access within that D365 arena, meaning you can't really reach out past the wall to get to other data beyond what's available within the entity store. So that certainly has, kind of some level of challenge for organizations that are wanting to report on a variety of different things. The other things that can be, particularly challenging if we're talking about Power BI embedded, and we do expect that there will be some more scenarios where folks are encountering Power BI embedded. The migration from a development to a production environment can be challenging because it actually is part of the ERP deployment. So you're actually promoting changes that would be considered ERP changes from a development environment to a production environment. So that obviously, kind of has some challenges. There are integration advantages specifically with D365. But again, it's talking to D365 at the moment. There's no real external, kind of advantages. And I would carry that forward to if any vendor is putting forward their own analytics platform or their own data store for the purposes of reporting. Generally, there's not a very strong integration capability with the other applications that you have. At least it's not an easy thing to do. And we've seen that repeatedly across all of the ERPs, but notably not only with D365 and the Entity Store, but also things like SAP Business One and their cloud analytics. And so those are things to just, again, consider if you're thinking about ways of connecting Power BI into the data. Direct query gives you a different level of behavior, but it also comes at a level of cost in this particular scenario. If it's a vendor provided data store, the ERP vendor provided data store, I should say. And so the Dataverse is potentially very interesting. The thing that we've run into, candidly, with a lot of customers that have explored the Dataverse, is they just don't want another bill to pay. And I'm sorry to kind of put it, kind of directly, but the Dataverse itself actually comes with really a strong schema for business reporting and kind of business structure around ERP applications, CRM applications, and a lot of others. They're continuously enriching the Dataverse. It used to be called the Common Data Service, if you're not familiar with Dataverse as a term. And what the Dataverse requires is, quite frankly, a lot of effort, to get your data there. So it starts with the building out of the data integration projects. You're actually having to work on essentially a project and entity basis. And so where you see the boxes 1, 2, 3 in, a lot of that is very much a repeating set of more administratively oriented tasks to schedule the data refreshes for the projects, to make sure that the data is flowing from those entities into the Dataverse, so on and so forth. There's a lot of things that Microsoft will hold out as success around the Dataverse, as they should, but there's just know that there's quite a bit of investment that goes along with this from an effort standpoint, as well as from a cost standpoint. I think that the cost standpoint, around that is along the lines of $10 to $40 per user per month. So it's pretty much kind of outside of the realm of normal for mid-market ERPs. But again, it is there. It is something that can be leveraged, and there is the ability to connect to the Dataverse directly from within Power BI. One of the last ones to really talk to is the concept of bringing your own database. And bringing your own database, setting aside that the BYOD is something that's a bit more of a Microsoft acronym, it's certainly something that we've probably seen across multiple ERPs, in that the vendors, for the ERP vendors, provide some facility of replicating the data, not only to their own kind of data store for purposes of reporting, but they also offer up scenarios where you can potentially replicate to your own. And so that's good, by the nature of offloading, the demand on the ERP application, supporting the reporting from those other data sources and that other data store. What it means in the context of BYOD with D365 is that you'd be creating an Azure SQL database. You'd be configuring the export of some number of the entities, and underneath D365 F&O, there's 1,700 plus entities. So you do have to administratively manage that. The challenge, that goes along with that is you are very much replicating the database schema. And so that means, and we love our friends, across the globe that have built these ERP applications. But if you look at SAP, there's obviously a German underpinning in the naming convention of the tables. You look at some of the other ERPs, you're not quite sure what language was used to define the names of the tables. And what that ultimately means is that you are actually having to go through some work on the modeling side within Power BI, which we'll explain in a moment, to really get to the point where end users have a more friendly experience. The downside, again, that goes along with this is if you are doing that level of modeling, a lot of times you're having to do that in a repeating fashion across multiple Power BI workbooks, unless you're creating some shared data models and things along those lines. And so that is something just to bear in mind, and certainly something to consider. And so 30 minutes into this, happy to kind of talk about one other element before we really kind of enter into exploring modeling the ERP data in Power BI. And that's the concept of data lakes. Now, we have heard a lot, being in the data management space, being in the analytics space for the number of years that we have been. We've heard a lot about data warehouses. Many of you have probably heard something about data warehouses. Data lakes is just another storage paradigm for data, but it's provided in a way that is considered maybe a little bit more cost effective than a traditional SQL database in terms of storage. But with that concession around cost, that means that there are some other elements that are not as attractive. The most essential when we look at data lakes and we look at what Microsoft is enabling around replicating data to data lakes from their ERPs, is they're not typically optimized for the purposes of financial reporting. And if you're here and you're looking at analytics, you're sitting there probably with a need to not only not necessarily reproduce your financial reports, but you have to be able to provide a financial reporting slant to your analytics that you produce. And so that is something to be very much bear in mind. The other is that there's other technology that needs to layer across the data lake in order for you to actively query the data. So think of it in terms of, there's kind of an interpretation layer, if you will, for the queries that you would be posting. And so that is not the most navigable of experiences, especially if you're IT constrained or otherwise are just unfamiliar. There would be a bit of a learning curve that goes along with that. So let's talk a little bit about, okay, so we've talked about the options for basically storing the data, but let's talk a little bit about what it takes to model the ERP data separately in Power BI. And for those of you that have no familiarity with Power BI, again, a lot of times you're starting off very simply with connecting to a data source and then starting to visualize the data from that data source. I think most of the demos that we tend to see from people that are demonstrating Power BI, they're dealing with very simplistic data sources. That is something to bear in mind, and just doing kind of a casual review of the number of entities underneath Dynamics, SAP1, D365. There's thousands of tables there underneath the Sage and SysPro ERPs. I know that there's hundreds of tables there. And so that can be an overwhelming experience, saying connect to a data source, say such as a database, getting all of these kind of difficult to interpret table names, and then trying to build a report, from that. That's where other additional tools within the Power BI Power Platform come into play around the creation of Power BI data sets, around the creation of Power BI data flows. And there's a gentleman, Reza Rad, who is an exceptional authority, if you will, on working with Power BI. And as you can see the quote kind of under the graphic on the right-hand side, if you're doing this, you're going to need to spend about 70% of your time on the data preparation. So using kind of his simple example, that means if you're doing a Power BI implementation for 10 months, 7 of those months are spent on data preparation with a tool that's part of the Power Platform called Power Query. So Power Query is kind of another piece to learn in order to get the data prepared to keep you from falling into the traps of what maybe you're already experiencing with Excel, where the sales leader has an Excel book that has reports and a few analytics in it that helps him or her understand that part of the business. And then the finance team has a totally different Excel workbook. They show up at a meeting and they can't agree on whose data is more correct. That is something that will repeat itself with Power BI if you don't get to the point of having a consistent data platform across both. So, and furthermore, some of the tools around data prep for Power BI are not necessarily going to solve for all of your requirements around transformation and those sorts of things as well. So it's something just to bear in mind. But modeling ERP data separately in Power BI, certainly relevant for OData, certainly relevant for things like the Dataverse and the BYOD, and even the data lakes for that matter. It really allows for you to create or introduce some optimizations for the reporting and analysis. By modeling it separately within Power BI, what you're doing is you're creating a single data store that then can be reused across multiple Power BI reports. It does require some additional work. Not an expert on Power BI licensing, but there are practical limits around the amount of data that you can store based on the different Power BI plan or license level you're at. That is something that needs to be understood, because you can't just simply say, I want to move all of my ERP data into Power BI models and report on it, because likely there's a limitation there. Either introduced by the license or introduced by your willingness for what you would pay for there. So those are things to just bear in mind. There are a lot of great articles in the public domain around separating the data model from your other Power BI analytics and assets. So the next kind of piece to talk to, and again, we're marching towards kind of showing you a little bit of technology here in just a few minutes, but integrating the ERP data into a data warehouse for Power BI really means that you're solving a lot of the problems that maybe were slightly more costly, doing the modeling directly underneath Power BI in either per report basis or modeling separately for multiple reports. What's great about building a data warehouse to support Power BI on top of your ERP is not only does it support what you need to do from an ERP standpoint and replicating the data from the ERP application, but it also allows for you to integrate other sources of data alongside of it. Typically, it involves less of the admin work associated with the traditional data replication that tends to occur, and ultimately does create a single platform of trusted information that can then be used not only for the purposes of Power BI, but possibly for other tools that sit within your organization as well. So that is something that we're probably going to focus on a little bit, is how do you get to the point of having a data warehouse for Power BI a bit more quickly and more of an automated fashion from tools that are available. So that really leads us to a fairly simplistic graphic. This simplistic graphic really just simply portrays that from a ZAP perspective, using an automation tool like ZAP Data Hub allows you to automate your ERP data from your mid-market ERPs, whether they be Dynamics, SAP Business One, Sage, SysPro, or others. Those are ones that we can very smartly connect to, and I'll explain what smart connectivity means a little bit later. But furthermore, we can connect to other sources of data and bring that into one single place. That single platform for data then can be the underpinnings of your Power BI reporting and really can satisfy a broad number of constituents that sit around or possibly outside of your organization as well. So in terms of choosing the right approach for the ERP data scenario, just some things to consider. We won't go into a lot of depth on this, but firstly, you really need to think in terms of what are your organization's capabilities. Microsoft has a number of great technologies that surround Power BI, that surround the Power Platform. If your organization doesn't have folks that know it or have the aptitude to learn it, then you're really probably working at a little bit of a disadvantage. So what does that mean? Does that mean that Power BI is not for you? Not at all. But what it does mean is that you might need to look towards other tools that allow you to kind of move quickly past some of those things that your organization couldn't otherwise take up. You also need to consider what are the other needs beyond the ERP data. We talked about that maturity continuum, and we talked about the evolution of needing to be able to incorporate other business data to support a real look across the business processes of the organization. It's healthy to understand that, before you embark too much on your Power BI journey. Certainly need to understand the approach that you're taking and whether or not pursuing a level of technical sophistication introduces other risks, changes the costs, all those things that are just practical and even more practical in this day and age where we're really kind of coming back to life as a lot of businesses in this time. And then lastly, what's the organization's perceived view on the amount of time that it should take before they get some value? If you're focused on something that is, as Ray's quote said, is going to take 10 months, and the business expects something in 10 weeks, obviously, there's some things that you need to do that might be a little bit different from a planning and choosing the right approach. And so the ultimate ways to use Power BI for ERP apps, we'll explore, a couple of topics here. I'm going to accelerate pretty quickly because I do want to make sure we get to showing a few things, but we'll talk about the concept of embedding. We'll talk about leveraging of the data. we'll talk about the approachableness of Power BI. And so the embedding is simply, or out of the box is probably a better way to describe it, great as a starting point. If you have the ability to have embedded Power BI solutions for your ERP application as a means of getting users understanding what Power BI is about, having a little bit of an experience with maybe some analytics that are not exactly a glove fit, that's not a bad thing. That will get them looking at it and saying, hey, here are some other things that we want to do. Here are some other things that we have to do in order to really fulfill our requirements. And so that clear direction that you get means that you'll make more intelligent choices around what data that you make available, how you potentially model the data for the business as you go forward. And ZAP happens to have some examples, from an out-of-the-box standpoint that I'll point to in just a moment. The other element is, again, thinking back to the needs continuum about what do you need to do to support that strategic progression and the support for leveraging the other data. It's really important, based on our experience, that you help decision makers that have been looking at one set of reports that say we also need this other data to be in a position to respond to that fairly quickly, and not have it be a protracted exercise that takes a long time to get there. And so that's where some of the nuances of what Power BI does, Power BI's modeling capabilities, and support through things like data warehouses really come into play in terms of the considerations that you make. And again, if you really are ultimately trying to drive a level of adoption, that means that the organization wants to continue to explore and expand the solution. Value's got to be realized, and it's got to be realized fairly quickly. And so those are things that we do want to make sure you understand. Lastly, approachable Power BI means more Power BI. We've oftentimes shared the view that analytics beget more analytics within an organization, because as people start to see insights, they naturally have some additional questions. They naturally have other things that they want to go after and get a hold of. If you can make it more approachable for them to do those sorts of activities, to be in a position that they can support decision making, but they can also support exploration, then you're really in a much more powerful place. And that couldn't be any more true than when you're focused on ERP data, because ERP data, as we all know on this call, is a very fundamental and foundational part of the way business looks at themselves. And so making sure that the look at yourselves is done right, we really recommend that you get the data right first. And so, again, in using this kind of graphic, we have customer information, we have sales information, purchasing, inventory, financials, and manufacturing in the ERP's context. That's all great sources of data. What you also have is you have third-party add-ons oftentimes that have enriched that schema, and you need to be able to pull that across. You may even have external CRM applications, or you may have external apps altogether. Bring that together in that single data warehouse ensures that you can use the Power BI tools that are available. And when you have the Power BI tools that are available, you can really deliver analytics for all of your different constituencies. So if you're not familiar with Power BI in totality, there's the Power BI desktop environment, there's the Power BI report builder that's synonymous with like reporting services. You have the Analyze and Excel capabilities and the mobile delivery. So all of those constituencies that are kind of represented by the people in that graphic all can have different things that make a lot of sense for them. And having analytics that uniquely make sense for different individuals means that you truly have analytics for everyone. And so from our perspective, what the analytics for everyone look like? Well, this is a nice set of screenshots from all of the analytics that we have delivered out onto AppSource that you are free to download for Power BI that address the financial area, the AR/AP area, sales, procurement, inventory, and manufacturing. And so that's probably where we will get to here very quickly. As a matter of fact, I'm going to jump straight into the software spotlight. And to do that, I'm just going to drag a browser onto the screen. And just as a reminder, as we go here, if you have questions that you'd like answered towards the end of this session, please do put them into the Q&A panel. So Our software spotlight, we really wanted to cover a couple of things. Firstly, help you understand, kind of where you go to find our prepackaged analytical content that's freely downloadable. That is available via AppSource. If you go to appsource.microsoft.com and you just simply put in Zap space BI, you'll get all of these items that will show up for you. Now, if you're not familiar with, kind of how to work with this, but you can click on the Get It Now, and that will take you into kind of a screen. Actually, let me just go ahead and click on this so you can see what it looks like. This allows you to kind of see a little bit more about what these things are about. There's videos and there's some screenshots as well to help you understand that. By clicking on Get It Now, it's going to promote downloading that app into your PowerBI.com workspace. And so speaking of PowerBI.com's workspace, if I'm already in here and I'm not in AppSource, I can also go to Apps. I can go click on Get Apps. I can search on Zap, as I was doing previously. I can go grab Inventory Analytics. Very similar experience to what we were just saying. If I click on Get It Now, well, of course, it wants me to identify myself, which is important. It'll do that super fast. Of course, we give permission. Go ahead and click on Continue. And so what that does is that then brings the app down along with sample data. And so I'm going to go ahead and click on Install. It says it could take a while. It actually doesn't take hardly any time at all to install. And so that then would bring that application into the context of your PowerBI.com workspaces. And so that's actually taking a moment. So what I'll do is switch over to another screen here. And if I go back to home, you notice that we have the different analytics that are available. I'm going to go ahead and click on this favorite and frequent. That's the supply chain management and sales. And so you'll notice there's a little yellow bar at the top that says, hey, you're viewing this with sample data. That's entirely okay. Power BI is probably a little bit slow at the moment, but this certainly works and allows for us to start to interact with what is delivered out of the box. There's 3 different views on this particular set of analytics that are available out of the box. So you can even point your decision makers at some of these sample analytics to allow them to kind of decide what's right for them behaviorally. Is this too much on a dashboard? Are there certain things that are not enough for them? So on and so forth. What you also have the ability to do, which I'll show in a moment, is you can build some reports directly off of that sample data, just so you can get a feel for what a really nicely structured model looks like. Or you can even go so far as to choose to analyze in Excel, which if I click on Analyze in Excel, what I'm going to not do for the sake of time, that actually pulls down an XLSX file that allows for some sales analysis, in which case you are basically interacting with that Power BI model using the pivot table capabilities that are just native to Excel. And so what's really great about that is if I go ahead and expand spending, I checked the box on spending, that gave me my net sales line invoice amount. If I choose invoice quantity as kind of a second, it's not going to work for me at the moment, but we can do those sorts of things. We've also integrated like storage location as a drop down here. We've also allowed for the ability to kind of interact with the items on the rows, all because that's naturally part of the pivot table functionality that's within Excel. So if you have users that say, hey, I'm not going to Power BI because I love Excel, they actually have an analyzing in Excel experience that's quite good for them. The other piece that I wanted to just briefly kind of illustrate, and I realize that we're slightly running out of time, is that you do have the ability to create your own analytics. And so in this case, I'll create a secondary page here. This is using that same sales data set that we were looking at just a second ago. So if I look into spending, yeah, I think I want to do maybe this one. Yeah, so let's do this inclusive of tax. Now I can change this, so I can change this to more of a card orientation. I can put amounts next to each other. Actually, don't want to do that. I'm going to go ahead and click off this. We'll do the tax amount We'll add that as a secondary card. We could do this for quite a bit of the data. Furthermore, what I might do is I might click off of this and have this this additional amount show up, and I'm going to actually look at this maybe by customers based on their geography. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in. Now, I don't particularly like the way that that renders, so I'm going to turn this into a tree map just as an example. And for those of you that aren't familiar with Power BI, it really is that simple to start to interact with a data set, start to build out some analytics. And the really ultra cool thing is automatically it starts to wire the pieces together. So for example, if I click on United States, well, apparently there's no taxes in the United States. In Germany, there actually is an amount, and so on and so forth. And so you have that ability to very quickly get to some information and start to render. What's important is a lot of the kind of underpinnings of the model, the plain English that you see here, was driven by the ZAP application itself. So we have actually intelligently interacted with the ERP. And so that's the very last thing that I want to show before we kind of wrap this thing up, is ZAP Data Hub is really a core element at creating an underlying model, creating that automated data warehouse. And so if I start here, very simply, a model consists of data sources, the various tables that are being pulled out of the ERP. We're automatically getting the relationships and a number of other elements. If I look at this D365 data source, what you'll notice is these are the tables that are in the application itself. Because of our smart connectivity, and this is true of all of the ERPs that we support, we're able to read the plain English captions. We're able to understand the amount of data that's within each one of those tables, so that you're in a much more intelligent position of choosing what tables or columns need to be included for the purposes of reporting. And it's very much a checkbox based metaphor that allows you to get to this point, so you can create that data warehouse quite easily, quite rapidly for the purposes of Power BI reporting. We're going to generate a model that's very easy for Power BI to interact with, and correspondingly, that means that you can spend more of your time focusing on learning how to visually present the data in Power BI, and less of your time figuring out how to overcome the complexities of, in this case, bringing in 1,700 tables, or in the case of SCP Business One, as you see here, multiple tables, or even in the case of Sage 300, as an example, these very cryptic underlying table names, no offense to Sage 300, folks want to understand this by the plain English itself. And so that's what really gives us that power and capability when we look over here to deliver information in a plain English manner, so that folks can really build reports and analytics much more easily and concisely using Power BI. So with those things said, I'll just simply minimize this and we'll talk very quickly about some key takeaways. Again, if you have questions, please get those into the Q&A panel for us. And I do need to make sure that that panel is visible for folks. So do put them in if you have them. But at this point, key takeaways, there's a lot of things that Microsoft has done incredibly well around Power BI within the ecosystem to give you connectivity to your ERP. You just have to make some decisions around how you're going to evolve into using Power BI from your ERP. There are quick and dirty methods that can be used that will ultimately take you back to places that you already were, with too many reports, not enough reports, things of that nature. You really need to think about the consistency of data from report to report or analytic to analytic. The options are going to continue to evolve. That is something that I think that Microsoft is just about guaranteed with Power BI since the beginning. We at ZAP believe that we do deliver on the best elements of kind of all the options that are out there, and make sure that your organization can very quickly be on a path to getting better Power BI. And the speed of time to value should not have large amounts of technical complexity, meaning that you should really end up with a solution quite quickly. So we do have some questions. I'm going to just share my contact details if you do have questions after the fact. One of the questions is, what is the average time to deploy a solution like ZAP connected to SAP Business One? The great news about that is within a week, an organization should have standard analytics that are delivered out of the box. They should have the data warehouse that is created from the B1 deployment. And really at the conclusion of that week, the organization should be really looking towards what is it that they want to uniquely do from an analytics perspective. And that's true of not only Business One as an ERP platform, but it's also true of the Sage products. It's also true of the D365 and SysPro products as well. We have a very consistent approach that we've enabled across a great network of partners to provide those types of solutions. We have another one. We have the requirements of creating dashboards and storing data inside separate countries. For example, our clients in USA want to store data there, but our UK clients want to store the data in the UK. So there's some data requirements for those different geographies. This is possible with Power BI or ZAP. With ZAP, you do have the ability to basically create models off of the ERP. Assuming all that data is in one ERP, you would have the ability to create models that are filtered. So UK data goes to a UK-based data center, USA data goes to a US-based data center. You can do that. You can also do some things somewhat similar within Power BI, depending on how you're wiring up to the ERP and what your ERP is. But again, there is a pretty high curve for modeling underneath Power BI with most of the ERPs. So that's a great question, but it is something that very much we can support. And so I'd encourage you to reach out to us either through zapbi.com or through my personal email at trey.johnson@zapbi.com. We've got a couple more minutes just to see if there's any more questions that are out there. One of the common questions, kind of comes back to, who can use the tool set like ZAP, because a lot of organizations, no offense to anybody on the call here, they've gone down the path of trying to use Power BI and they've hit a lot of stumbling blocks because maybe it's a little bit more technical than they thought it would be. The great news is organizations can inherit from our business partners a ZAP-based data warehouse solution that they can manage very much on their own. So when they want to add additional data sources or tables or columns, that is something that they can choose to do as their own, or they can work with their business partner around that. And frankly, it makes for a much easier experience around Power BI. So we have really appreciated the opportunity to spend the hour with you. There was one final poll that I think I am going to throw up just to see if we could get a little bit more feedback from everybody. And of course, while that poll is up, if you do have additional questions, put them into the Q&A panel. I'm really happy to answer anything that you might need. Of course, we are here and available to you at ZAP. If you would like a more tailored demo to talk specifically to your ERP, to talk to Power BI plus your ERP, that is something that we do quite often ourselves and through our network of partners. So with that, I know that folks are voting, which we greatly appreciate. Please continue to register your vote there if you would. That is bringing us almost to the hour. So we're going to let the poll continue to run, but if you have to leave, we hate to see you go. We hope you come back for our next webinar. My name again is Trey Johnson. That is trey.johnson@zapbi.com. Please let me know if you have any questions or any follow-up, and we will certainly be sure to make this recording available to all of you. Thank you so much for your time today, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.